Have you ever had those family members that drive you crazy? We all have them. Maybe you are them. Well, today we're going to see a Bible story about sometimes our family members are hard to love. But how do we do it anyway? Let's check it out. Hey, we are so glad that you're here today. First, I want to say, if you are new with us and you're just checking us out, I would love to meet you at the tent right after church. Just get to say hi, hear about your story really quick before you leave. And two, I want to echo something Scott said, is most of you sat, actually all of you did, on a Christmas Eve invite. Some of you moved it, some of you just sat right on it. You're being invited to Christmas Eve right now. And that is for you to take to someone else, to invite them to come, because Christmas Eve and Easter are the two most times that people are susceptible, that are kind of like trying out church. You can pull on their heartstrings. You can use a little guilt trip if they have some old Catholic guilt in their life and use that, right, to show what the season's really all about. And you see, we are in the middle of Christmas season. And I don't know about you, but I love Christmas. And one of the things I love about Christmas is family. It's one of my favorite parts. But if I'm honest, one of my least favorite parts of Christmas is family. I'm so glad you laughed. Because I was expecting some angry stares, okay? And maybe you're thinking, I know that sounds really rude and sounds mean, but it's honest, okay? Because there's times, especially in this holiday, where we're gonna be around family some more. And I know, like, you have to love your family, and I do love my family, but there are some people in all of our families that might drive us a little crazier than others. When you're sitting at that dinner table and they say something and you want to roll your eyes and you're like, I hope my face isn't showing what's going on in my head, right? You got to just like smile and be like, oh yeah, cool, give me more food before I say something I regret later. We all have those family members. And just a caveat, if you don't have those family members, you are that family member, okay? All right. You think you're nice, but no, I'm just kidding. But all of us have that in us, and those family members that drive us a little bit crazy. And if we're honest, some of our family members are a little bit more of our favorites. We love a little bit more than the rest of some of our others. Some of you know, I have a great relationship with my father-in-law. And some of you guys know my father-in-law. If you've been at this church, he's come and preached here numerous times. He started a church. He starts other churches around Arizona now. Dr. Monty Patton, I like to call him. He doesn't like the doctor part, but he earned it. But he's an amazing dude. And like, I have a great relationship with my father-in-law, so much so that we get lunch pretty frequently. And usually we don't tell my wife or his wife, and they find out later. They're like, were you ever going to tell us? We're like, you didn't really ask. I'm like, but here's a stamp card from Cafe Rumba, so don't be mad, okay? Like, smooth it over. But if I'm honest, not everyone in my family has that same special place. And today, I think that brings us to, I kind of want to start us off with a key thought this morning. And I think we get from our text is that it's easy to say we love our family members, when in reality, we may not even like them at times, okay? That's harsh. And I know that sounds rude and that sounds mean, but I think there's a little bit of truth to it. Sometimes you say, I love you, in the back of your mind, be like, but I don't want to be around you at all. But also, just because something's true doesn't mean it's good, and doesn't mean it's the way we should operate. And today, as we go into this Christmas season, and as we kind of live this, and maybe we're coming in contact with some of these family members, or maybe they're not even family members, or just close friends that kind of drive us a little crazy, I don't think we should just reserve in our heart, yeah, like, you drive me crazy and I don't like you, and just leave it at that. Instead, we should ask ourselves as well, how do we love them more? And this is the question I want us to pose and spend some time answering today, is how do we truly love our family members this Christmas season? Every single one of them. Even the ones that drive you crazy, even the ones that get on your nerves, even the ones that don't agree with you politically or know what to say to set you off. How do we truly love them like Jesus loves them? If you have your Bible, go ahead and flip to Genesis chapter 29. In Genesis chapter 29, we're going to jump into this story. And if you were with us last week, we kind of read about this super dysfunctional family. And we said in there is like, how do you not replicate a dysfunctional family? And there are some good things we could pull out of that, but this is kind of the next step. Because even if we sometimes try not to have a dysfunctional family, and maybe in like our immediate family, we're seeming like we're pretty good and have our stuff together, it's inevitable that some part of your family, an extension of your family, has its issues and has some people that will drive you crazy. So it's not a question of like, how do we stop that? But how do we show love in the middle of it? And today is kind of the next step of how do we love those people around us? How do we show Christ to them? And today I want to really hit on big 3 don'ts. The 3 things that we should not do and that we don't want to do, and some relationship lessons that are attached to this that we get from the life of Jacob. And all this starts in Genesis chapter 29. And our first don't today is don't drag your unaddressed baggage into a relationship. Genesis chapter 29, starting in verse 1, it says this, that Jacob resumed his journey and went to the eastern country. Now, let me give you a little context of this. Jacob is this guy who we followed last week, and he kind of picked up his life and ran off. And in a little bit of background on here, the reason he did this is because he got in a pretty big fight with his brother. His brother Esau, he was a hairy man, he was a man's man, he was a hunter, his dad loved him. And then there was Jacob. He was smooth-skinned, he liked to play video games and cook at home, and he was a mama's boy. And they fought a lot. Esau was a brute, Jacob was smart. Jacob won that battle. But he won that battle at the expense of deceiving his brother, getting so angry, saying, I'm going to kill you. And it wasn't like one of those where you just punch. He was literally going to kill him. So Jacob, mom pulled him aside and said, hey, go talk to your dad. He has one last little closing word for you, and leave. Like run away so you do not die. So Jacob packed up his stuff and he left. And he's running away from his family. And actually kind of the last parting words that his dad gives him is like, go to this land. And this is where some of your relatives are. Your uncle Laban, his mom's brother, is there. And find yourself a wife there. And start a family, start a new life there. And maybe eventually you can come home, but right now your brother still wants to kill you, so stay away for a little while. And he's like, start this life. And this is how we see as this story kind of progresses. Skip down to verse 9 of chapter 29. And it says this, while he was speaking with them, this being Jacob, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. As soon as Jacob saw his uncle Laban's daughter Rachel with his sheep, he went up and rolled the stone from the opening. He watered his uncle Laban's sheep. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and wept loudly. Okay, a few things. I know you think it's weird that he kissed his cousin. Little bit different time here. It was okay to marry your cousin at this time. This isn't in the South either, right? This happened thousands and thousands of years ago in ancient Near Eastern culture, and this was normative, okay? That's a different story. But it was okay to do this biologically, it wasn't as terrible. But I just love, Jacob kisses her and then cries. Really interesting way to go about this, right? I don't think this is like the best move to pull. Like, I don't know if he just was so welled up with emotion, whatever. But in verse 12, and then he told Rachel that he was her father's relative, Rebekah's son. She ran and told her dad. She's like, dude, this dude just kissed me. What's going on? We're like, all right, what's happening? Well, Jacob, he leaves his land, right? And then he gets to this new land and he sees Rachel. And as soon as he sees Rachel, he's like, that's my future wife. He just knew, right? We're in Christmas season, so hopefully you're watching Christmas movies. And one of my favorite Christmas movies, because I kind of take this on replay value, is Elf is a great Christmas movie because you can watch it and it's continuously funny, okay? Like some you watch once and you're like, that movie was cool to watch once, but I never want to see it again. You can watch Elf over and over and over again. And one of the scenes in there, right, is when Will Ferrell sees Zooey Deschanel's character, and he sees her and he like talks to her that night or whatever, and he goes like, I'm in love, and I'm love, and he's dancing around the house, and all right, you guys are all super cheery and know your movies. But this is how I picture Jacob at this moment. He is just like love struck. He sees Rachel. He's like, she's amazing. She's everything I want. I'm following my parents' commands. I'm going to find a bride here. Rachel's mine. I'm going to marry her. And he got these love eyes, and he's going to make some dumb decisions in a second of how to make him his wife. But here's the problem, is he goes into it, and a little bit different is when Isaac, Jacob's dad, went and kind of wed Rebekah, his mom. Isaac was still at his family's home. And he had some money, he had some power, so they kind of gave a gift, and he got Rebekah's hand. It's kind of how it worked then. Jacob has nothing. He's got no money. He's got nothing to give away. So he has to go talk to his uncle Laban. And he's like, all right, I want to marry your daughter. He's like, okay, sounds cool. So Jacob is like, I'll work for you for 7 years. That's a pretty big ask, right? 7 years, that's a good offer that Jacob gives. I don't know if I would have done that for premarital counseling for 7 years pretty much, right? I'm gonna do this for 7 years, I'm gonna work my labor, take no wage, and then I get to marry your daughter. That's a huge ask. And so Jacob says, yep, let's do it. But here's how all that turns out. Skip down to verse 21. Verse 21 of Genesis chapter 29. Then Jacob said to Laban, since my time is complete, give me my wife so I can sleep with her. He's like, boom, 7 years, it's done. And it even says he was so in love that 7 years felt like days. Okay, so he just flies by. Verse 22. So Laban invited all the men of the place and sponsored a feast. That evening, Laban took his daughter Leah, who's the oldest, and gave her to Jacob. And he slept with her. And Laban gave his slave Zilpah to his daughter Leah as her slave. When morning came, there was Leah. I love the exclamation mark that has in scripture. She was there at night too. It wasn't just the morning, okay? There's so many questions. So he said to Laban, being Jacob, what is this you have done to me? Wasn't it for Rachel that I worked for you? Why have you deceived me? He married the wrong sister. You see that? He wanted the other one. He's like, what is happening? And after you actually go and if you read, I know we have a lot we're covering today. It even talks about really Rachel's the beautiful one in scripture is how they say it nicely, and Leah was not. She had a little more homely eyes and Rachel had striking eyes is kind of how it puts it in there. So he gets there and he's like, what in the world? This is what and you may be hearing this and okay, some things don't add up. How did he not know? Skip back a few chapters if you want to. In chapter 24, verse 65, gives us a little background on this, where it talks about when Isaac finds Rebekah. And it says this, and asked the servant, who is that man in the field coming to us? The servant answered, is my master. So Rebekah, Jacob's mom, she took her veil, she covered herself. Then the servant told Isaac everything he had done, and Isaac brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah and took Rebekah to be his wife. Isaac loved her, and he was comforted after his mother's death. You see, in this custom, they took the bride and they veiled her. Now, I still have so many questions. He had already kissed Rachel once, so he probably should have had a background of what that would like. I mean, how thick of a veil was this? There's just so many things. And was there alcohol involved? I have no idea. But some of this we can chalk up to Laban deceived him, and I think Jacob was overexcited. That he just got lost in the moment and was just so excited that it was finally here and really wasn't doing his due diligence and checking his boxes. Is it the right bride? But here's what sticks out so much in verse 25. And I just want you to catch this. Jacob asks at the very end, he says, why have you deceived me? This is the same word, deceive, that Esau uses to accuse his brother Jacob of what he had done to him. You see, this is kind of a fast forward when you look at Jacob's life and you see it in this grand narrative of Jacob destroyed his relationship with his brother. He strained his relationship with his dad. He left his family in shambles, and then he ran away. He actually even met God along the way in Bethel, and there's this crazy story that's awesome in between all that. But there was still this baggage, this history that Jacob really never brought out to the daylight and dealt with. He had deceived his family. He had torched some relationships, and he just wanted to hop into a marriage and thinking, as soon as I marry this really good-looking girl, all of that's going to go away and my life is going to be great. But somehow that past followed him. Here's a relationship lesson I think that we can see from the life of Jacob is that when we expect someone else can heal our hurts, we are asking them to do something only Jesus can. He thought Rachel would fix all his problems. I'm going to marry this awesome bride. And she was probably great. She was a shepherdess. She knew this thing. She was great looking. And he's like, once I get married, all my problems are going to be gone. But he just found out he had a bigger problem on his hands. And for us personally, I think when we look at our hurts, our hang-ups, and our habits, a lot of times we wish we could just brush them under the rug. You see, like if I ignore them long enough, they're bound to go away, right? If I just pretend they're not there and then I meet new people and I don't tell them about that past, then eventually it's just gonna be gone and it's not gonna be there and I don't have to deal with that stuff anymore. But that baggage has a way of following us. And so often when we put our trust in a program, when we put our trust in a people saying this is going to fix it, we get disappointed when it falls on its face. That's why we're so passionate here about Celebrate Recovery. We have it here every Wednesday at 6:30. And I like to say is like Celebrate Recovery is not a program. It's a path of healing that points to Jesus as the ultimate healer. And when we see this here, he went about this all the wrong way. Instead of stopping and reflecting on his life, Jacob thought, I can just fix it by going to another place. He's like, the grass on the other side of the hill is greener. And I was thinking about this way this week is that we always want to say like, hey, once I get over this hill, it'll be fine because the grass is greener on that side. But a lot of times, here's what we do is we start taking the same watering can to the other side and keep watering the grass, realizing we're watering it with poison the entire time. The problem isn't the place. The problem is with what we're taking with us to there. And we see this in Jacob's life in such a huge, abundant way that there is this unaddressed baggage that he brought into this new relationship. But this also comes to our second don't as we continue this story, is also don't see your failure in someone else's success. Let's keep reading in Genesis chapter 29, verse 31. And before we actually jump into this, a little kind of catch up here. So he marries Leah. He's not happy about it, but he's like, all right, I'll work another 7 years for Rachel. So he got a 2-for deal. He got 14 years for 2 daughters, and he married them both. See that going bad places? Yep, I do. Verse 31 of chapter 29 says, when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was unable to conceive. He wanted Rachel all along. He didn't want Leah. And this was a messed up situation that Jacob kind of created. It's interesting, if you actually fast forward, Genesis is written by Moses thousands of years later, who would later get the law. And when the law comes out, you know, one of the things in there is not to marry sisters while they're both alive, okay? I say alive because it was custom. If you were married to a sister and she dies, usually the next in line, if they're unmarried, you would marry. Same with brothers on the other end. But it never says marry 2 living sisters. It says don't do that. Don't marry multiple people. God didn't intend that in the garden, and he even puts laws against that. Because every time polygamy happens throughout the Old Testament, it always ends terribly. And he has this messed up situation, but here's what's so crazy is God still uses it. He still has mercy in this situation and still does something amazing with it. Look at verse 35 of Genesis chapter 29. It says, and she conceived again, this being Leah. She gave birth to a son and said, this time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she named him Judah. Then Leah stopped having children. Judah is the son that will later lead to the tribe of Judah, which would be where Jesus' line is traced through. We'll come back to that in a second. But here's what starts happening. And then let's go to verse 1. And then it says this, now when Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she envied her sister. Okay, Rachel's good looking, but she just gives me straight crazy vibes here, all right? Give me sons or I will die. Okay, what is Jacob gonna do right now? He's like, what did I just get into? What is happening? I worked 14 years. I have 2 wives, and they're both a little insane. What's happening? But she just tells him, give me sons or I will die. She saw Leah's success. She looked at her sister. And this is the crazy thing. Even though Jacob loved really Rachel and kind of just tolerated Leah, which is terrible to say, and that's why polygamy is not a good thing, she looked at her sister and she saw success by bearing children. She saw the blessing by bearing children. And she began to resent her sister. And all of a sudden, she compared her life to someone else's life, and she started getting angry, and she started getting mad. And Rachel then gave her slave to Jacob and said, hey, get children with her. And it even got so petty. If you flip down to verse 8, Rachel said, in my wrestlings with God, I've wrestled with my sister, and she named him Naphtali. So she had her slave, gave to Jacob. He had some kids, and she said, hey, we fought, and I won because I just got a kid out of it. But did you? Like, you're like, what in the world is happening? And then it gets worse. Look at verse 9 of chapter 30. It says, when Leah saw that she had stopped having children, she took her slave Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Are you losing count of how many women? It's 4 women. 3 of them are bearing children right now, okay? They're just throwing more wives at Jacob, and he's like, all right, I guess we'll have more kids this way. Can't make this up, man. That's why the Bible's amazing. It's history, and even when it's ugly. Verse 10. Leah's slave Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, what good fortune, and she named him Gad. You just look at this, and I'm like, as I was preparing, I'm just like, how weird is this? Like, it's just such a crazy story. Like, and why in the world would you do this? But like, if you back up, and I just kind of this little section we read, and like this back and forth of throwing slaves and having kids, and it's nuts. It started out in Genesis chapter 29, verse 31. It says, when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved. All of this started when God saw someone who was struggling, who was hurting, when was unloved, who had been pushed off to the side, and God did something through her. And God started to bless her. Now, when God blessed Leah, it led to Judah, who would eventually bring the line of Jesus. And when God sees something, and he says something needs to change, blessing and grace and mercy pour out of it. But then you keep reading the story, and then it's when Rachel saw her sister. When Leah saw Rachel, and when they saw stuff, they started comparing apples to apples. They started getting mad. They started making stupid decisions, and bad consequences started to ensue from there, which I think gives us our next relationship lesson that we see here is when we judge our lives in comparison to others, we will never find the contentment found in Jesus. You see, both of them could have celebrated some things. It was a weird, messed up, jacked up situation, right? It was just crazy. But Leah could have been like, man, I have these children. This is amazing. God's going to continue our line. This is going to be great. And Leah could have been like, I have this loving husband who really wanted me over my sister, right? And it was a weird situation, but like my husband loves me and this is great. Instead, they looked at each other's lives and they wanted what the other one has. And during Christmas, this can be so easy to do. I want what that person has. I want what this person has. I want that. I want this. I want that. Why is my family not as good looking around the tree and they're all looking at the camera? Or why didn't I get that for Christmas? Or and we want to fill in the blank with all these things. And when we start this comparison, it leads down to this where we're just miserable and we are angry. But I love how this section closes out. Of 22, if you go to chapter 30, verse 22, it says, then God remembered Rachel. He listened to her. He opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son. And she said, God has taken away my disgrace. She named him Joseph and said, may the Lord add another son to me. Rachel then has a kid who is Joseph, who after Jacob is gone, Joseph is going to be the main character of the story that takes us through the rest of Genesis. And all this crazy, messed up thing, it's amazing that God still works through it. Amen. Last Christmas, on our final Christmas Day, my family is like a little crazy. Both our parents are in town, so we do our own Christmas with our kids, and then we go to my in-laws, and then we go to my parents. And then we try to fit naps in there in between, and screaming children, and it's just madness and fun and terrible. But our last stop was my parents' house, and there's cousins there, my brothers and all their kids were there. And it was kind of this like funny thing of, as like all the cousins are just opening, we try to do them one at a time, and it works for like 30 seconds, and they all start ripping open packages. And my son Archie was watching his sister, his brother, and his other cousins open all these presents, and he had got like a book and some clothes, and that was it. And then they're pulling out these gifts, and he's like looking at them, and I could see he's like getting so discouraged. He's like, "What did grandma do to me?" And he's like, and then we left. And that was it. Like, there was no more presents for Archie. And we went home, and like, I was like, "Sorry, bud. I mean, your book is really cool, right? Like, I don't know what to say." A couple days later, my mom called me and said, "Hey, I forgot to put out a gift for Archie that was wrapped in my closet." Because we didn't even say anything to her. I didn't want to make her feel bad. And we got it from her. It was this dinosaur wedge pillow that's about as big as him that you can like lay on. Probably his most used gift in the last year. He sleeps on that thing. He uses it for quiet time. He uses dinosaur forever. But he was so mad when he was comparing his gifts to his siblings. But grandma eventually remembered him, and he was made whole in his way. And in our lives, God is kind of the same way. That we want to compare and say, like, "I don't have enough. God, why didn't you give me this? God, why didn't you give me that? God, why didn't you give me that?" But it's on our own timeline. And God still remembers us. God still loves us, and he'll provide in his own way. Last don't, as we kind of wrap this up and we continue this story, is don't burn down bridges after you cross them. Chapter 31 of Genesis, starting in verse 1. It says this: "Now Jacob heard what Laban's sons were saying. Jacob has taken all that was our father's and has built this wealth from what belonged to our father. And Jacob saw from Laban's face that his attitude toward him was not the same as before." Verse 3, "The Lord said to Jacob, 'Go back to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I will be with you.'" Jacob had had enough of his father-in-law. He could not stand his father-in-law. And he was just waiting for the opportunity. He's buying his time, and they just clashed and clashed and clashed. But Jacob's like, "I'm just working, I'm building wealth, I'm building this great thing." And you can go into the story, and it's awesome to see kind of how God provides in that situation. But God finally says, "All right, leave, get out of here." And that was all Jacob needed to hear. But a little caveat in here is God didn't tell Jacob how to leave. And it's safe to say, as we continue the story, that Jacob didn't quite leave the right way. Skip down to verse 17. And in verse 17, it says, "So Jacob got up. He put his children and his wives on the camels. He took all the livestock and the possessions he had acquired in Paddan Aram, and he drove his herds to the land of Canaan to his father Isaac. When Laban had gone to shear his sheep, Rachel stole her father's household idols, and Jacob deceived Laban the Aramean, not telling him that he was fleeing. He fled with all his possessions, crossed the Euphrates, and headed for the hill country of Gilead." Think about this for a second. Jacob got up. He packed his wife. He packed his grandkids. I've lost count on how many there are. You can go detail it. 4 wives, a lot of kids. It was a ton. And then he slipped out in the middle of the night without saying anything. It's kind of messed up. This was Laban's daughters. This was later Laban's grandkids. And they fought and got mad, but he just left. And Laban was actually pretty hurt by it. Check out verse 25. It says, "When Laban overtook Jacob," so he follows him, "Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country, and Laban and his relatives also pitched their tents in the hill country of Gilead. Laban said to Jacob, 'What have you done? You have deceived me. You have taken my daughters away like prisoners of war. Why did you secretly flee from me, deceive me, and not tell me? I would have sent you away with joy and singing, with tambourines and lyres, but you didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters. You have acted foolishly. I could do great harm, but last night the God of your father said to me, watch yourself. Don't say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. Now you have gone because you have longed for your father's family, but why have you stolen my gods?'" Jacob and Laban start arguing back and forth. We heard that Rachel stole some of those household gods, like the idols that Laban had in his house. And it even gets worse, because then Jacob, as they're arguing, says, "All right, fine. Like, you're mad at me, I'm mad at you. Go into my camp, and I didn't steal your gods, so I don't even know what you're talking about. Search my camp, and if you find them, we'll kill the person who took them." And Rachel, shows how good of our family was and how dysfunctional it was. She actually hides the idols under her. She sits on them, covers them with her clothes. And when her dad comes in, she's like, sorry, I can't stand up. I'm on my period. You can't make this stuff up. It's in the Bible. I'm telling you. Just so messed up. So then they come back up and Jacob, Laban comes and says, I couldn't find anything. And see what Jacob's response was here in verse 36, Genesis chapter 31. It says, then Jacob became incensed. He was so mad, and he brought charges against Laban. What is my crime, he said to Laban. What is my sin that you have pursued me? You've searched all my possessions. Have you found anything of yours? Put it here between my relatives and yours. Let them decide between the two of us. I've been with you these 20 years. Your ewes and your female goats have not miscarried, and I have not eaten the rams of your flock. I did not bring you any of the flock torn by wild beasts. I myself bore the loss. You demanded payment from me that was stolen by day or night. There I was, the heat consumed me by day, the frost by night, and sleep fled from my eyes. For 20 years in your household I served you, 14 years for your 2 daughters, 6 years for your flock, and you have changed my wages 10 times. You think this is all about this one incident? I think Jacob had been holding on to this for a long time. He's like, let me tell you, father-in-law, what I really think of you. Verse 42. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, the fear of Isaac had not been with me, certainly now you would have sent me off empty-handed. But God has seen my affliction, my hard work, and he has issued his verdict last night. Then Laban answered Jacob, the daughters are my daughters, the sons my sons, the flocks my flocks. Everything you see is mine. But what can I do today for these daughters of mine, for the children they have borne? Look at the disaster this has become. And when you're sitting at your Christmas time table with your family, I just want you to think of this exchange, okay? Hopefully your family's not this bad. But just think how this is boiled up. This didn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen because of this one instance of Jacob did. This is because for 20 years, these dudes despised each other as family members, but never really talked about it. And so they dug it deep down. They got angry. They let it brew. It grew so much that it even strained the relationship between the daughters of Laban and himself, that Jacob kind of put a divide in there. And honestly, as we read this today, there are some relationships even in our lives that may feel like this, with family members or friends that are toxic, that even like Jacob, we might need to walk away from. But I think it's important in the manner we should do it. And here's our final relationship lesson that I think we're going to get from this today, and we're going to see in the text where this kind of comes up, is that when we have to walk away from a relationship, like Jacob had to do, we should leave a chance for reconciliation through Jesus. Let's keep reading in verse 44. It says, come now, this is Laban talking, let's make a covenant, you and I, let it be a witness between the two of us. Laban says, kind of time out. I know we're mad at each other. I know we're angry, but we're still family. Let's see if we can kind of have some sort of peaceful negotiation in this. Skip down to verse 53. And as they go back and forth, it says this, then Laban kind of continues, and it says, the God of Abraham and the gods of Nahor, the gods of their father, will judge between us. And Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. Then Jacob offered a sacrifice on the mountain and invited his relatives to eat a meal. So they ate a meal. They spent the night on the mountain. Listen to 55. How drastic this is. Laban got up early in the morning. He kissed his grandchildren and daughters and blessed them. Then Laban left to return home. You see, they come to a place of reconciliation. They still parted ways, and it was probably for the best, because Laban had deceived Jacob, even though Jacob wasn't innocent. He had been taken advantage of in so many ways. But when they left this place, it was a grace-filled conversation that God had entered into. And you may have some relationships this season that honestly, you might need to walk away from. Maybe it's become toxic. It's become dangerous. There's something in your life that you know this just isn't right. It's not right to stay here because it's causing more harm than good. But when we do walk away from something, I think it's important that we don't burn the building down on the way out. Because that's so what we love to do in our society today. That maybe if a relationship breaks up or a family member gets thrown out, we want to talk bad about them. We want to say how horrible they are. We want to blast them on social media. We want to tell the rest of our family members how much of a deadbeat they are. And we want to destroy that relationship instead of leaving room for grace to enter the conversation at a later date. You see, this has been an awesome story. It's been a soap opera. Hollywood can't write these type of stories, right? There is nothing like history. They should do like a Netflix series on the Old Testament. It would be a nightmare of crazy stories. But before we go today, I want to give us a little recap. And I want to kind of just challenge you. If you're like, I know this has been a lot to take in, but like, what are my next steps? What are some things that I can kind of start to apply today? First one is this, is let God heal your wounds. That was Jacob's first problem. Is he didn't let God heal him. Instead, he took that baggage with him. He kept it going. When we talk about the Christmas season, some of the themes, and when we talk about Advent, two of those are peace and hope. And I love that because when we talk about God healing us, let me just tell you, there is hope that your present situation doesn't need to stay your present situation. There is hope that your addictions, your hangups, your habits, that God can take them away. He can change them. And then there is a peace that can come in your life that can replace the anger, the resentment, the conflict that is in your life. Let God heal your wounds this Christmas season. But not stop there, but also let God fill your life. You see, the second issue in this story happened when they started comparing. When they started being jealous, when they started saying, I want that life, I want this situation, I want that kid. Like, I don't know why they kept wanting more kids, because then they had to watch all those kids, right? It's like, I want this. But let God fill your life. Another Advent theme, another Christmas theme is joy. You will never know true joy with money and with power and success. You will know it with an eternal God who loves you. Which brings us to our last one, is let God supply grace and unity. I don't know what your family situation is. I don't know what your friend situation is. You may have so many relationships in your life that feel strained, that feel unhealthy, that don't feel good right now, but God can provide grace. And when God forgives, God can unify, even in the worst of situations, even in the most hopeless of situations, because he loves us. And all this goes back, and I just love it when we look at it in this Christmas season, that this is all possible because God came down to us. That even in our sin, even in our trials, even in all our mistakes, we celebrate this Christmas season that God came down to us to live a perfect life, to die on a cross, so we don't have to be stuck in our ways, but we can know something better now in eternity through Jesus Christ. Let's pray this morning.